Hello. Today we're going to work on simplifying expressions with negative exponents. Okay, so here's an example, 10 to the negative 2. Okay, now a lot of times it'll say they don't want negative exponents in your answers. Okay, so let's put this one in the calculator, but then we'll get the idea of what to do with negative exponents. Okay, so to put that in the calculator, I'm going to do the 10. Then on my calculator, I have this caret symbol. It's on the left. It's the fifth button down for me. And I type in negative 2. And that gives me a decimal. It says 0.01. Okay, so really the question is today, how does this work? Okay, we're not going to be writing decimals. We're going to be writing fractions. But let's see where this number comes from. Okay, so when I have a negative exponent, 10 to the negative 2, I'm going to think of it as that 10 is in the wrong spot of a fraction. Okay, so if I write a fraction, I would put that over 1. Okay, so this negative exponent, it's telling me that 10 should be in the denominator. It's in the wrong spot. It's in the numerator, so I'm going to switch it to the denominator. And when I switch it, I'm going to change the exponent. Okay, so it was negative, but now in the denominator, it's going to be positive. I do need a place value holder for the top of that fraction. So I'm going to put a 1 on top. Now, these are going to be your final answers. If we put that in the calculator, we would get 0.01. Okay, but for these problems, we're just going to simplify it so that they do not have negative exponents. Okay, so here are some examples. We're going to rewrite these so that they do not have negative exponents. Okay, so this first one, I can put it over 1. But that 7 to the negative 3, that negative 3 is telling me that 7 is in the wrong spot. So I'm going to have to rewrite it. That 7 should not be a numerator. It should be a denominator. And when I flip it to the other side of the fraction, it becomes a positive exponent. Okay, now don't ever leave the top blank. If you don't have any numbers there, you're going to put a 1 on top. Okay, and that's it. Okay, so that 7 was in the numerator. It should have been in the denominator. Okay, same thing down here. That 12, that negative 4 is telling me, oh, flip that 12 to the denominator. And when I switch it, I'm going to make the exponent positive. Okay, you're going to be doing this with variables also. Okay, so if I have x to the negative 10th power over 1, well, that negative 10 is saying, oh, flip that x. That should be a denominator. So it should be 1 over x to the 10th. Okay, so see if you can do this last one. Write it as a fraction. Should be 1 over 3 to the 5th power. Okay, so let's look at some examples where the negative exponent may be a numerator, but it could also be a denominator. Okay, so this first example. The 3 is okay as it is. It's a numerator. It doesn't have any negative exponents. I'm going to leave the 3 alone. It's the x to the negative 2 that's in the wrong spot. Okay, it's a denominator, so I have to switch it to a numerator. And when I switch it, the exponent becomes positive. Okay. Now I can put a 1 underneath here if I want. Okay. But when it's a denominator, you do not have to write that 1. Dividing by 1 will not change any number. Okay, let's look at this one. So the 1 is okay. The x is a problem because it has a negative exponent. Okay, so that is a denominator. It has to switch to a numerator. So it'll be 1x to the 3rd. Again, I don't have to write a 1 in the bottom. I don't even have to write this 1 in front of the x either. I can just write x to the 3rd as my final answer. Okay, the 5 is okay. That's a denominator. It doesn't have any negative exponents, so that will stay. This is the issue. X to the negative 1. So it's a numerator, has to switch to a denominator. X to the positive 1, and I can't leave that top part blank. And here's one last one to try. Okay, hopefully you left the 2 alone. And you move the x to the negative 4 across that fraction bar. So it was on the top, it's going to come to the bottom. And I'm going to put a 1 to hold that numerator. All right, here are some more fractions, but this time the whole fraction is raised to a negative exponent. Okay, so 3/5, that whole thing is raised to the negative 2. What that means is that both of those numbers are in the wrong spot. That whole fraction is flipped the wrong way. Okay, so I would flip that whole fraction, and I would make my exponent positive. Okay. And the one on the bottom left, this whole thing, both of those numbers are in the wrong spot. Okay, that whole fraction needs to be flipped. So I would flip the 8 to the top, I would flip the 3 to the bottom, and my exponent now becomes positive. Okay. Make sure you're including these parentheses, because it's actually both of these numbers to the 4th power. It's 8 to the 4th power divided by 3 to the 4th power. Okay, so those parentheses will show you that that whole fraction is raised to the 4th power. Okay, I have a negative exponent here. That tells me I need to flip or take the reciprocal of that fraction. So instead of 1 over 2, I'm going to have 2 over 1. And instead of a negative 3, that should be a positive 3. Okay, try that last one. Okay, the reciprocal means I flip that whole fraction, so 7 over 6. And instead of to the negative 1st power, I have the regular 1st power. Okay, so now we're ready to take on expressions. So we're going to rewrite the expressions so that they do not have negative exponents. Okay, so some of the answers that we get have negative exponents, but they don't want the answers to look like this. Okay. So the 6 is fine. I can put this over 1. The 6 doesn't have a negative exponent. I'm going to leave that in my numerator. The x has the negative exponent. So it's a numerator. It belongs as a denominator. X to the positive 4. Okay, so you're going to handle each of these terms in your expression separately. Okay, so the 12, I look at that as one part. Okay, so 12 doesn't have a negative exponent. Leave it alone. The x, I'm going to put it in red because that's the trouble one. X is to the negative 3. That has to be on the bottom. And I'll turn it into a positive 3. The y is fine. The y is to a positive power. So I'm going to leave the y to the 5th power. Okay, this third one, put it over 1 so I can tell which is the numerator, which is the denominator. Okay, this time the 15 is an issue. It's raised to a negative power. Okay, so the 15 is a numerator. It needs to be a denominator. The x is okay. The x is to a positive exponent, so the x I'm going to leave alone. The y also has to be moved. The y is to negative 7. It needs to be moved to the denominator, y to the positive 7th power. Okay, let's do 3 last ones together before you try some out. Okay, the 72, that's fine as a numerator. The r to the negative 3, that negative exponent tells you that r is in the wrong part of your fraction. It needs to be in the denominator as a positive 3. Okay, handle each part of this term separately. So the 5 is okay. 5 does not have a negative exponent. The r, let me trace these in a different color. The r is okay. The r doesn't have a negative exponent. The f, trace that in red, because that's in the wrong spot. F needs to be moved to the bottom with a positive exponent. The q is okay. Does not have a negative exponent, so I can leave the q alone. Okay, and the last one before you practice. Okay, 15 does not have a negative exponent. 15 stays where it is in the numerator. The x has a negative exponent, so the x has to move to the denominator. The y has a negative exponent, so the y has to move. Remember, when we move it across the fraction bar, we turn it into a positive exponent. And the z has to be moved. The z should also be in the denominator as z to the third power. Okay, here are some to try out. Okay, hopefully for this one you left the 75 in the numerator, but you moved the x, made it x to the 6th in your denominator. Try out this next one. Okay, the 12 should have stayed in your numerator, but the x to the negative 4 had to move to x to the positive 4, and the y to the negative 2 had to move and become y to the positive 2. Okay, and there's one more written on your page to try. Okay, I hope you left the x where it was. You moved the y to the denominator. And you left the z where it was. Okay, and if you have time, I made up one challenge one to try out. All right, this challenge one has a lot of parts to it. Okay, so start with the top. The 3 doesn't have a negative exponent. The 3 can stay where it is. The x has to move. X was to the negative 2. So it's going to go to the denominator, x to the positive 2. The y was okay. Y to the 3rd can stay. The z had to move and become z to the 7th in the denominator. All right, now we can look at the denominator. The 5 was okay. Okay, usually we write the numbers out front, so I'm going to put the 5 in front. The a had to be moved. That was the denominator, so I'm going to move it to the numerator. And the last part, the b, was okay where it is. It can stay as a denominator.